Welcome, everybody, to the California State Archives. It's so nice to have you all here today. My name is Sebastian Nelson. I'm an archivist at the State Archives, and we're going to be talking today about some of the treasures that we have here at the archives that are helpful for doing family history research, and I hope you enjoy it. So the California State Archives, we're a division within the Office of the Secretary of State of California. The State Archives was actually established in 1850 by one of the very first laws, Chapter 1, Statutes 1850. So we're one of the oldest organizations within the government of the state of California. And we're located here in downtown Sacramento. We've been on this land since the 1950s, and the building we currently occupy opened in 1995. It's a 170,000 square foot facility, and we have 6 floors of stacks where we store historic records, the treasures of California. We can store approximately 146,000 cubic feet of records, and we already have more than 120,000 cubic feet of records in storage. And the State Archives appraises, accessions, arranges, describes, preserves, and provides access to the historic records of state government. The Archives collections is primarily composed of records from the Governor's Office, the legislature, state agencies, the Supreme Court of California, the California Courts of Appeal. And the records are arranged by the name of the entity that created the records. But maybe I should back up a moment. What exactly is an archive? And what are records? And how can any of these things help you when you're researching your family history? Well, many of you might be familiar with archives, but if you're not, we have some similarities to a public library. Most people are familiar with public libraries. But libraries tend to have what we call secondary sources, published sources, books, magazines, things that theoretically there might be an identical copy of floating out there somewhere in the universe. If you can imagine, when you go to the public library, you can walk around, you can browse the shelves, you can pick up a book that looks interesting and flip through it. Of course, if a book or a magazine from a library gets damaged or stolen, it's tragic, but it might not necessarily be the end of the world, because theoretically you might be able to find an identical copy out there to replace it with. In an archival setting, especially here at the State Archives, the materials we have are primary source documents, original records, things that, for the most part, there are not identical copies out there in the world. It's the one and only instance of that piece of information, for the most part. Consequently, there's a number of things that flow from that concept. So at an archival facility, we must have a much higher level of security than a person might expect to encounter in a public library. Probably the biggest difference would be the fact that we have what's called a closed stacks facility. But luckily, as part of my talk today, we will be able to see some of these areas that members of the public rarely get to see. We have a closed stacks facility to ensure that the records that we have are very secure. And consequently, we do not allow members of the public to browse our shelves looking for interesting boxes to pick up and flip through. Instead, we have to have the boxes paged and brought into our research room here for people to look through. So because of that, how do people actually find out what kind of information we have? Well, what we have to do is our staff, our archivists, my coworkers and I, have to create many detailed inventories, lists, and catalogs that describe the records we have and what information they contain. And these catalogs, lists, and inventories we call finding aids. And a finding aid is really the key resource that allows members of the public to get an idea of what kind of information our records contain. But what exactly are records? What do I mean when I say records? Well, there's a couple different state laws that try to define that word. There's one law called the California Public Records Act, and it says, quote, "Public records include any writing containing information relating to the conduct of the public's business, prepared, owned, used, or retained by state or local agency, regardless of physical form or characteristics," unquote. There's also another law called the State Records Management Act, and it says, quote, "Records are all papers, maps, exhibits, magnetic or paper tapes, photographic films and prints, punch cards, and other documents produced, received, owned, or used by an agency regardless of physical form or characteristics. In other words, the State Archives holds millions of documents, hundreds of millions of pieces of paper, over 20,000 maps and architectural drawings, over 250,000 historic photographs, more than 7,500 audio and video recordings, thousands of bound volumes, and hundreds of three-dimensional artifacts. We have some records that are only a few months old, and we have some records that date back to the late 1700s when California was still a part of the Spanish Empire, and tons of stuff in between. And it's a literal treasure trove of information about California's history. According to the California Government Code, my boss, the Secretary of State of California, may receive into the archive any item that she deems to be of historic value, and no record can be destroyed unless the Secretary of State has determined that the record is inappropriate or appropriate for preservation in the state archives. However, we only receive about 1% to 2% of all records created by state government. And we invite members of the public to use our records to help research their various projects that they're working on. We have a lot of people that come in that are interested in working on their family trees, genealogical researchers. We have people who come in who are interested in California history, the history of state government. A lot of our researchers are interested in the history behind the various state laws passed by the legislature. We have a lot of records that are helpful for that. And the best way to begin your archival research is to use our online descriptive catalog, which has a funny name. It's called Minerva, and Minerva is the name of the Roman goddess of wisdom. And she also appears in the Great Seal of the state of California right there. And the website for our online archive or online catalog is www.sos.ca.gov/archives, archives/collections/Minerva, Minerva. That's the URL for our online catalog. It's a great place to start your research. Now, please note that the Minerva catalog merely describes the type of records that you can find here. It is not an index of personal names, businesses, legislative bills, or court cases, and it doesn't necessarily have specific information. You would actually need to develop keyword searches based on a broad understanding of your research topic. Now, as of the time of the filming of my talk here today, our public research room has reopened,